All right. Well, good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the Multiply Mini Rural Church Ministry. My name is Dan Wells. I'm the pastor out at Dresden in the mighty Muskingum County, and really excited to welcome all of you today. These Multiply Minis, I think, are relevant, timely trainings that are intended to multiply your impact in your church context. And before we get started today, I want to just offer a word of Zoom etiquette. I know we've all been made like Zoom professionals over the last 2.5 years, but just a quick word: stay muted unless you're talking. We want to really encourage you to use the chat for conversation and questions. So there's going to be a large section of our time today that's dedicated to discussing your questions. So throughout our time today, put those questions down in the chat, and then feel free to turn off your video if it's needed. For visual wise, you can adjust your Zoom screen to adjust to speaker view in the shared screen. And I just can't tell you how excited I am to be here with all of you today to talk about rural church ministry, something that is near and dear to my heart. And I think that I think now is the time to really reconsider how we do rural church ministry and how we are present in community in rural places with rural people. And so I want to provide a little bit of intro for our guest today. Tyler is an appointed clergy for the Farmhouse in rural Metamora, Ohio, of the West Ohio Conference of the United Methodist Church. Having grown up in Toledo, Tyler went on to attend the University of Mount Union, where he graduated in 2012 with a bachelor's degree in interpersonal and peace communication. It was also at Mount Union that Tyler met his spouse, Vanessa, and started a church on campus. After graduating, they left for Pasadena, California, where Tyler attended Fuller Theological Seminary, only to be brought back to Ohio by the unexpected birth of their first child, Landon. And they've since added 3 more kids to their family, Torrin, Quinn, and Cohen. And while Tyler grew up in various Christian circles, he left the church for a season of his life, only to come back in hopes of changing the church that he had lost hope in, which is very similar to my story as well. And so the Farmhouse, as a new church start, comes out of this vision to reimagine the church in hopes of reimagining its rural community. Tyler also writes, teaches, consults, and podcasts on the platform Becoming Human, and co-hosts the podcast The Bible Archives. And of course, Tyler and his family live in Metamora, Ohio. And so I am just so excited to introduce Tyler to all of you today. Hopefully, I know it's going to be a great discussion today. So Tyler, go ahead and take it away as we discuss rural church ministry today.
Thank you, Dan. I looking at the chat and just seeing where some of you are from. I'm both impressed and pleasantly surprised at how many of you are Northwest Ohio, and I recognize some of these places. So, thank you all for joining in. Kind of my plan this morning is I'm going to do a very brief overview of all of the content that I can, and I want to leave a significant amount of time to talk about what you all want to talk about. So as we're going, if there's something that seems more important or more of a priority for you, write that down or put something in the chat, and we'll come back and spend significant time on whatever's the most viable for everyone in the room. So I'm going to share my screen, partly so you don't have to look at me anymore. And hopefully this will also help you kind of organize the content in your head. So this is all based on the book that recently was released with Michael Beck, who is a great visionary for church leadership in general, and he's from Florida. And this book kind of came out of mine and Michael's relationship and my particular emphasis on the rural aspect of church. And I should say that introduction did a good job of making it known, but I'm not originally from a rural community. I actually grew up in Rossford, Ohio, and I saw Rossford listed in the chat from Rebecca. So Rebecca, that's where I'm actually from. And then I went to school, high school in a very urban environment. I went to Toledo Central Catholic High School, and then Mount Union, and then Pasadena. So I was in very urban areas for quite a while. But I've lived in a rural community for the past 10 years now. And in my opinion, I don't know if everybody from the rural community would agree with me, but in my opinion, I have become very rural, and it has become a pretty steady passion of mine. So that's where this book comes from. And a lot of the things we're going to get into are parts from that book. So there'll be more depth in the book if there's something that stands out to you as well. But we'll also divert a little bit and get into stuff that is not necessarily in there. So here's kind of where I want to go to start out, particularly looking at why rural places matter and getting into some of the theory behind this whole discussion. And I know that the emphasis here is practical, and I want to get into the practical stuff too, but I think it's important to look at some of these dynamics to kind of set the foundation for what's going on with this whole aspect of rural churches, 21st century. Why does that matter? What should it look like? What should inform how we're thinking about this? And I'm also going to say most of this is my subjective experience. So you might disagree with some of the things that I bring up here. You'll probably have other depth that I haven't thought about. Some of this is based on research. Some of this is just my experience and conversations that I've had. So the first thing I want us to consider, and this is one aspect that you might actually disagree with, rural decline. It is a catchphrase that gets used quite frequently. I do think that there is some truth to it, and I would probably go ahead and say that generally rural decline is happening. More importantly, what has caused that? And what I think is really important here is that there are a diverse number of reasons that rural decline might be happening. And no one aspect of this is going to be true about every single place. So what we're about to get into isn't me saying, and this is everything, and it's not going to look the same everywhere. Every rural community is different, despite the generalized stereotypes. They're all different. But I do think there are some generalized stereotypes that could be helpful for us to consider as a group. But these won't be accurate for every single situation. So here are some that I think are playing a pretty heavy role right now, at least again in what I've seen. And the first one that doesn't always come up is travel connections. And I am kind of asking you to reach back historically to pre-automobile. But a lot of rural communities, at least in the United States, began as travel stops to other major areas. So you think of a railroad that had a stopping point, and that became a rural village. Or where I live, Metamora is a day's horse ride between Adrian and Toledo. And so that's kind of why Metamora grew in the place that it is. As technology has continued to grow, and travel connections have increased, that has affected rural communities. How it's affected them, that's something that still needs discussion, but that's one that I want to point out. Technological changes is another aspect that I think is incredibly important, especially when you're thinking about globalization, when you're talking about commodity enterprises versus subsistence enterprises, just considering how technology has changed relationships, has changed availability. So that's one. The next two are not necessarily quantifiable, but intergenerational disconnection and neighborliness are both ways to try to grasp at the relational connection between people. The intergenerational component, the best way to think about that, in my opinion, is how property was often handed down within families, and that happens less often now. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it happens less often. I recount a story where I was actually driving through Metamora, Ohio, with an elderly woman, and she was going through and pointing at all the houses and saying, "This was so and so's house, and this was so and so's house, and this was so and so's house." And then there was kind of this moment where we were like, "But you don't know who lives there now," because it used to kind of stay within the same family, and now that's changed. There's a lot of critique that the educational system has something to do with this, with the conglomeration of schools and then the kind of sending away to university. All those are discussions that can be had. And I think neighborliness goes alongside of that. Food access is something that I think is really worth considering within this, and we'll get into more of that later. Industry and economics, especially absentee land ownership, and having different industries come into a town, which supports the economy. Usually that's based on tax incentives. How has that affected things? And then periphery economies is a subject that deserves its own space within this whole conversation. And the concept there is there's core economies and periphery economies. And we usually think about this in terms of third world, and rightly so. And I'm not trying to say rural America is a third world country, but the way that the relationship works between a metropolis and a rural terrain is usually that raw materials are used in one form or another to help support the core. And that relationship has continued to grow within the past century or so in rural places. And then consumerism. And consumerism mostly going to how rural places produce less and less of their own stuff, but also how rural places have lost a little bit of autonomy within that relationship, where it's not too far-fetched to say that rural places mostly consume at this point, where if you go back 100, 200 years ago, rural places were producing most of what brought them life. I'll add here, just because this comes up sometimes, of somebody going like, you're just anti-capitalist or something like that. I think the capitalist discussion is worth having, but I'm also not going to sit here and say, hey, if we could just go back 300 years, that'd be so great. Because I also understand the reason why these changes happened, because life was really hard. So I'm not trying to be critical here. I'm just trying to pay attention to maybe some of the factors that have contributed to the situation that we're in. Of course, there are others, and especially if you're like, oh no, I have some ideas here, I would actually love to hear what those are. So feel free to start throwing stuff out in the chat. I love that conversation. But here's why I wanted to start with that, because I think there's a couple outcomes of this situation. And the first is practical. The reason why I want to start with thinking about rural decline is because if we're trying to ask questions about what we should be doing as a church, and what our churches should look like as we continue to move into the terrain that is our contemporary world, we should know what's going on. We should know what's changed. We should know why it's changed. We should be paying attention to those things. And then we should be asking, what do we do now based on what we've seen? So trying to have a certain attention or awareness of the situation, that's necessary information if we're going to start making decisions, or else we're just guessing. So we should be asking these questions about our specific communities, because they're all different. So that's one of the reasons that I want to put that stuff out there, is because it helps us ask those questions. The second reason that I think it's helpful to consider this is because of perception. And what I mean by this is the stereotypes and assumptions that people who are not from rural places have about rural people and rural places. As somebody who spent a good half of my life being very urban, I can at least tell you from my perspective that these perceptions are there. I had them. But if we're going to be thinking about how we're interacting with the world around us, we should also ask questions about how does the world around us see us? How does that shape our interactions? How does that shape the relationship between these places? Because ultimately, I do think that rural places and urban communities should be in relationship. They should be working together in a variety of ways. And I go into more detail on some of these perspectives in the book, but a couple that I'll just throw out. One is that rural places are just worse versions of what society demands. You know, we have slower internet. We're further away, so we have to drive to the cool places where, you know, if you live in the city, you don't have to drive as far. So we're just worse versions of the same thing. Why would you live out there? Literally a question that I get a lot. Another more general, and I'm not saying these are true. I'm saying these are perceptions, that rural places are backwards. You've probably heard that used at some point or another. Another one that is, I think it's true, at least as a perception, and might not come to mind, is that rural places are sort of the peaceful countryside. That's where you go to retreat. That's where you go for recreation. It's where you go to retire when you want to get away from everything. So I think rural places are seen that way as well. And then one that comes up, especially when I'm interacting with younger people and the whole education university conversation, is the only reason you'd live in a rural place is because you happen to be born there. There's no other reason somebody would end up in a community like that. So it's by happenstance. So that perception, I think, is there. But what I want to emphasize here, and again, I am not saying this is true. If you are from a rural place, I am not deeming this as a part of your identity. But generally, the perception seems to be that rural places are the places called nowhere with people called no one. And I think that's helpful to consider based on some of the biblical precedents that we get as well. So let's pivot here. And I know this feels like I am just rambling information a lot. We will stop here at some point and dive into this. So make sure if there's something you want to come back to, make a note of that. Okay. So I do think that the theological angle here is important. And I want to get into that. But I also don't think that the importance of rural communities is just theological. I think there's a sociological value here as well. And so do rural places, do they actually matter? Do they deserve respect, credibility, influence? And not just, hey, should people think positively about them, but actually, should we have some voice in this conversation? So here's just some general statistics about rural communities. The population of rural communities, and this is just the United States, is 60 million people. That's actually quite a bit of people. Rural communities make up 97% of the land in the United States. I would say that's significant. There are 19,500 rural places, and that's only the official ones. Okay, so that's places that have a rural designation, but are also small. But for example, most like villages or townships with 500 people or less don't even show up in that statistic. So there's even more than that, but 19,500, that's a lot. So when you're saying, is Metamora, Ohio as important as New York City? Well, no, based on most of the statistics you would get. But when you say, what about rural communities in general compared to a New York City? Now it starts to take shape. And I do not want to make this political, though I do think there's some politics behind it. But this came to this came to notice in the 2016 election, right? Where people were going like, where did all these voters come from? Well, there's a lot of people in rural communities. And Wendell Berry, which if you're like listening to me and you're going like, this sounds a lot like Wendell Berry stuff. Yes, I'm not going to hide that at all. Wendell Berry actually has an essay he wrote about that situation in general, where he's just drawing attention to like, hey, rural voices are actually quite powerful. We should pay attention. We should pay attention to that. But here's another question that I would ask within these statistics is, okay, if the population of the United States is 270 million people, how do you feed 270 million people? How much land do you need to feed 270 million people? And one of the critiques that we're seeing post-COVID, hold on one second. One of the critiques that or just notices we're having post-COVID is, hey, our linear food system and our linear trade system, this globalized trade, it has a downside to it. And if we have 97% of the land, should rural places matter just for the sake of economic reasons? And if economy begins where economy is produced, most economy begins there with rural communities. So that should matter in the conversation, and that should go against some of the stereotypes that we see. But the other thing that doesn't show up in statistics is the history and skills of rural places. And I have kind of learned to see rural communities as kind of like the village elder of a metropolis, like the wise one that kind of is willing to sit off to the side, but they're the one who has all of the answers and knows all of this stuff and should be listened to, but is rarely consulted. I think rural communities kind of function like that because there's a certain skill set that exists, usually intergenerationally, partly that we're starting to see get lost, but that doesn't exist anywhere else. And having that history and having those skills that have come throughout the human narrative still be present is something that should be considered. And then you have what I think starts getting us into some theological discussion, which is the relational capacity within rural communities. Because if you take a place like New York City, you can never live in New York City and know everyone in New York City. This was my experience in Los Angeles. There was no way for me to have relational connection and belonging in that place as a whole. Rural communities are actually built for that. And psychologically, this is something that's been discussed. There's something called Dunbar's number, where they say that the amount of people somebody can have actual relationships is about 150 people. So the human side of the size of rural communities actually seems like it's an advantage and something that we should be considering when we're talking about the church world. And one thing I like to push against with city folk, as I now call them, is that rural places are certainly unfortunate in a lot of ways, a whole number of ways, actually. But there are components of rural places where they have something that I think every human being desires and needs, and that's to belong. And that element of belonging is something that we as church leaders should be leaning into when we're making decisions about things. And that also is not always a positive thing, because I would say I belong to my rural community here, and it comes with all of the small town gossip that you imagine when you think about rural communities. So belonging isn't a romantic thing, but I think it's a human thing. So that's kind of what I'd put out there sociologically, but what about theologically? Do rural places matter theologically? Short answer, yes, they do. The long answer of this is that I think that the Bible actually promotes the equivalent of rural places. And I'm not going to go too much into detail on this, but a couple of things that I would point out is the biblical view of progress. I think sides with the experience of rural communities in the modern United States. Genesis 1 through 11 would be an example of a text that seems to promote this. And then the one I like bringing up, just because it gets said a lot, without a whole lot of depth being given about it is milk and honey. So we're all used to, the land of milk and honey. The land of milk and honey actually has a really important depth to it. A lot of ancient rabbis would talk about this. I'm not, for the sake of time, I'm not going to get into that now, but I've written on this elsewhere where I've tried to explore what milk and honey means, but there's a certain subsistence and dependence that is promoted within the Torah that deals with this phrase of milk and honey. And that all comes back to this idea of the wilderness. And when you look at the role of the wilderness within the Bible, it's always an esteemed place. It's a difficult place, but it's an esteemed place. And it's always, anytime there's a monumental event that God is unfolding, it starts in the wilderness. And I think you can make a case that rural places, especially with our situation of decline, we're the modern day wilderness. And then, what I said with the perception of, rural places are the places called nowhere with the people called no one. Well, what's the biblical story? God works always begins in the places called nowhere by the people called no one. We point out, and I know this is not a new idea for any of us, but Jesus being from Nazareth was a rural location. So those are all things that we should be considering theologically, that I think there is an actual biblical precedent for some of this. But then let's start getting into some practical stuff. And I want to bring up thorn bushes only because it has been an incredibly useful visionary tool for the church where I am, but also because I think it captures this biblical narrative a lot. So I'll give you the brief version, which is there's a rabbinic commentary, often called a midrash, on Exodus 3, where the rabbis are debating about what kind of bush God shows up to Moses in. And those are the interesting conversations that the ancient Jewish rabbis tend to have. And they said, well, it's a thorn bush. And then the commentary goes on to say, well, why would it be a thorn bush? Well, because when God created the garden, God lined it with thorn bushes to protect and nurture the vitality of the garden. So, of course, God would show up to Moses in a thorn bush, telling Moses that the covenant of the Jewish people was to be a thorn bush for the world. And we've found a lot of solace in going, so as a rural church, our job here is to be a thorn bush for the community that we call home. And this is where I would challenge us to consider what it means to reimagine the church, because if the church is in decline and our communities are in decline, I think the church has the propensity to alter that situation. And I know this is a big dynamic within churches right now of, fresh expressions, new church starts. Our conference has been having this conversation for a while, but I think we might need to step back and go, all right, if we are going to actually do things differently, if we're going to change our situation, let's just start with understanding what is the core essence of what it means to be a church. And reimagining the church as a thorn bush is one way that's helped us. But for the sake of our conversation going forward, here's the way that we define church within the book. And this is not meant to be like some primer on ecclesiology. This is just a way that we used. The church is a medium for the kingdom of God in a local context through a living web of relationships with a collective purpose. If that's helpful for you, great. But as we go on, that's kind of the premise that I'll be using. So what does this mean for rural churches? Here's a couple of things that I think are of value. Rural communities and rural churches have a unique demographic. And one of the ways I'd point this out is rural communities have less people. So think back to that Dunbar number, right? Less people. But rural churches also have many of the same problems, Many of the same problems and many of the same problems and not the same kind of diversity, but the same amount of diversity. And that can be a little bit like, hey, you're saying rural places are diverse. Ethnically, no, we're mostly white, and that is a problem in and of itself. But ideologically, economically, socially, culturally, there's still a lot of diversity in rural communities that cause problems between neighbors, that cause problems between aspects of the community. And yet we have less people in which to interact with. So if you wanted to have a 10,000 person megachurch in a rural community, you're going to either need a lot of visitors or tourists, as we might call them, or it's just not going to happen. At the same time, if you wanted to have a rural church of a substantial size where everybody thought the same way, also probably not going to happen. So we have a unique demographic. I think that rural churches and rural communities also have a unique role in the function that they play, especially historically within rural communities. And this goes back to kind of frontier America and rural churches sort of being the hub of that rural place as it was trying to survive. And then a unique situation. And what I mean by this is that rural churches, for the most part, at least I know my rural church has this situation, we have less resources. And we have less people, but usually we don't have a ton of money. I do know some rural churches even around me that have rather large savings accounts, but for the most part, resources are an issue. We also have a certain sense of desperation right now in rural communities, which maybe that is why you're even interested in this conversation. But rural churches, for the most part aren't thriving. I don't know that that's completely a bad thing. That can actually be an advantage. But then also rural churches have a ton of potential. And I'll sum that up with the bottom of this slide. The rural church today, even with its issues, might be closer to the experience of the church's essence than most churches in the world. What I found as I have kind of gone through church history is that the situation I've experienced in my rural church, in my rural community, really resonates with the situations occurring within the early church, especially. And that all leads me to, what is my central premise for why I am a pastor in a rural community, because a healthy rural church in a rural community could be that which changes everything. So it's not just that, hey, we have sociological value here, or hey, there's a biblical precedent. It's also, if we do this right, if we unfold this correctly in its healthiest way possible, it could help our church, could also help our community. And if you have a very healthy rural community, what does that do to the surrounding areas? And this is where I kind of would push against urban clergy of going like, hey, you might want to invest in your rural areas a little bit, because if a rural area dies, what does that do to its surrounding area? What does the loss of a community cost? What does the loss of millions of farmers cost to society? So I think we should have some influence within that conversation. All right, let's get into more practical stuff now. If we're reimagining the church, what should be involved? This is how I've broken it down for my own headspace. There's two parts to this conversation. There's formation and transformation. And if you are kind of looking ahead, you realize that this deals with two aspects of church ministry in general. But formation playing the role of, we have to know the vision, we have to experience that vision so that it shapes us, and then we need to become and participate in that vision. And then transformation being anything that enacts that vision within the world. But I want to be clear that the primary goal, if you noticed in that definition I gave of church, the primary goal is always the kingdom of God. That's it. At the end of the day, if that's what happens, then the church has functioned in the way that it's supposed to. I think formation and transformation are two ways necessary to make that happen. But if you had to pick one thing here, you're picking transformation for the kingdom of God. That's ultimately the goal. Other ways that we break this down are, you need to guide and you need to gather. Guiding to affect that transformation, but the gathering part is still necessary. So I'm not going to be a voice that comes in and says, "Hey, Sunday morning or the church as a whole, it's relatively useless." The missional movement sometimes gets that critique, but there is something to be said for, if we're going to be thorn bushes, we should probably know how to do it. And now we have this really important aspect within church history, which is formation. One other thing I want to say about this, because we are, I assume, mostly United Methodists here, is when John Wesley talks about the parish, and you probably all are familiar to some extent of the parish conversation with the Anglican Communion at the time, and the world is my parish, right? There, that's very inspiring, and I love that. But there's also something to be said for, do we see our communities as the parish as a whole, as a part of our church's life? Because I know we would all say, the church isn't just a building. Most churches in the United States tend to function in the opposite way, though, where the churches primarily are just the building. And that's a part of this. Now, rural places have a building use that I think is really valuable still. So I would not be one to say, hey, go get rid of your buildings. Because one thing that rural places tend to lack are third spaces. So you have the public, you have the private. We don't have any of those third spaces in between. And even, at least where I live, there's very few public spaces as well. And if you think back to Frontier America, the church being a hub of that community, part of that was a location for people to be together, right? So I want to make sure I said that before we got going any further. So what should rural churches do? I'm going to give you my opinion on some of this. And just full disclosure, a big section that I'm skipping right now are some of the principles of rural communities. So for the sake of totality, I'm gonna just say them really quickly. Some things that I think are important to consider. We get into more about this in the book. Creating belonging, having your hand on the pulse of your community, context. And one of the ways that I phrase this is, in order for you to care about your community, you have to know your community. And in order to know your community, you have to see your community. And there is something about proximity and presence that rural churches are, we kind of have built in rural communities. But that's something that I think needs to continue to be emphasis, is the local component of this. Lateral leadership is something we get into, developing trust and relationships, and especially in this conversation of like, hey, how do we handle really hard political conversations or cultural conversations? And, where should we take a stance on this? Well, in the end, your primary stance should be the relationship with the people that share your home with you. So then figure out that other stuff. But that's the primary thing, those relationships. And then another concept that we get into is roots and growth, that you need to be well rooted in history and tradition, but you also need to have this propensity for creativity and growth. And then another thing that we will not really get into much today is ecology. And I do think rural churches should be having conversations about ecology. Okay, so anyways, what should we do? Here's what I want to get into. Trying to pay attention to time. Dan, you're probably going to have to cut me off at some point.
Hey, keep rolling, Tyler. I'm over here shouting amen, preach it. I mean, you're spot on. Yeah, keep rolling. We've got a little bit of time. We'll break out into the Q&A here in about 15 minutes or so. So
Okay.
keep rolling, man. I'm loving it.
Okay. And again, I'll go brief through some of this. Some of it might seem unfamiliar, as like non-downloadable content, place economy. What are those things? Again, the book, I forget. Did you all get a book? Is that part of?
Yeah, everyone should have received the book if they registered
Oh,
by a certain date.
okay.
October 10th,
Well,
I believe.
then great. I can use that as my excuse for, hey, there's more depth there.
That's right.
Okay. So I want to start with this question though. And you've probably seen this in some form or another, but it's a helpful reflective exercise to do occasionally. If your church closed, who would care? A stereotype of rural communities is that the only person who would care, the only people who would care, are the people who are members at that church. I think that innately goes against the very essence of why the church exists in the first place. And if we're trying to reimagine our rural churches and therefore our rural communities, this question can really help prompt a certain way of thinking that helps propel us into, okay, so what should we do now? And this is why I really wanted to start with rural decline, rural situation, sociological value, theological value, because it helps us to kind of see the whole situation and then decide what to do based on that. So especially if you're a church leader, it's charge conference time, right? Everybody's either doing or preparing for or debriefing from charge conference. Ask this question as a church and allow it to inspire, what do we need to do? What kind of church do we need to be? So that if our church closed, there would be masses of people saying, no, 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 we can't let that happen. How does that need to go? But let's unpack these a little bit further. So if somebody were to ask me, what's the point of church? Well, we got that definition, medium for the kingdom of God, but then formation and transformation. And I just wanted to flesh these out a little bit more. And when I say transformation, you're going to hear me use a word health. And the vision statement of the farmhouse is to foster the health of our place. And some people are like, why health? Well, health can actually be translated as more theologically correct terms within the Bible. John Wesley actually uses the word health to discuss some of the vision of the church. But when I say health or transformation, we're talking about salvation, and particularly how Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, talks about salvation, good news, resurrection, new creation, kingdom of God, right? On the other side of formation, it's not just teaching people things either. Experience is a huge part of formation. And Dan so kindly noted my bachelor's degree. It's one of the only times I get to use my bachelor's degree. Communication. And churches have to do a lot of communication, and very little of it has to do with what you say from the pulpit. So I think that's all under that umbrella of formation. But before you're going to come up with any ideas, I feel a duty to bring up the local emphasis. And this is not to say that you should not be involved in regional ministries or national or global initiatives. That's all still fine. But I think if you look at church history, the reason that any of the ecumenical councils happened in the first place was because the church was so hyper local that they all sort of developed into these diverse ways to where they said, hey, we need to get everybody on the same page. And I think over time we've lost that the church is meant to be a local body, unified globally, but a local body. And so we need to be hyper local ourselves in responding to our context. And one of the things that I feel obligated to push against is this almost innate process of just franchising something we see another church do. It doesn't work, and we get this sometimes where pastors or church leaders will either come or they'll email me and, hey, can you help us start a farmhouse Sabbath in such and such church? And I'm always really honored by that. Farmhouse Sabbath is, I don't even know the best. Is it a ministry? Is it an event? It's a lot of things, but it's something that we do. And I'm honored by that. But I always say no. You have to figure out your own version of that. And so what I push for is don't just franchise out the next best thing that you see on popular media or within church circles. You have to transpose good ideas to your context, which means you have to know your context, which means you have to see your context, right? So the same way music works, you exist in this key, and this song might be in this key, and you have to transpose keys. And pastors should be better at transposing these things. But then ultimately, the goal is that you should be constantly responding to your place. So there's not a checklist of ministries or missions that you need to do. It's you need to go, what's going on here, and what do we do about it? What are the gifts of our place? What are the needs of our place? How do we respond to that? Who are the people here? What are the relationships? All of that stuff comes together. And when you start there, now it's, oh, we need to do this. And that's literally how Farmhouse Sabbath started for us, is we were just responding to what we saw, and it kind of went in its own direction. So I want to make sure that I bring up that, but let's get into these two ways of formation and transformation. And immediately you should be thinking about church services when you hear formation, right? What do we do about our church services? Full disclosure, if you came to a church service at the farmhouse, you would be like, what is going on here? Why is everything so bad? We don't do church services well according to kind of the standards of the modern church world. And I'm at a point in my life where I don't have any shame in admitting that. But what would make someone want to come to your church? And by that we go, oh, to my church service, which brings up the whole, is the building Sunday morning the equivalent there? But what would make somebody want to come into that space on a Sunday morning, let's say? Further, what would make someone want to join your church, to join the thorn bush, right? And usually one of the ways we would articulate this is that, well, they need to come so that they can hear the gospel, right? Or, our quality on a Sunday morning is better than whoever's. And there's a couple of problems with that. One, you can hear the gospel in a lot of places now. And especially post-COVID, you saw this kind of globalized opportunity to listen to a church service from any single part of the world. So I don't know if that's going to be the best thing we have to offer. Second, the quality. Here's the deal. If you're banking on quality, like our preaching's really good. Okay, awesome. Our music is really good. We have 18 screens, and that's more than the church down the road that only has 17. If you're banking on quality, you have to realize that you are competing with every single church within the world at this point because of multimedia and internet technology. What I would push us to go is, what would make someone want to come to your church? Is there anything unique about your gathered body that should become a priority for how your church interacts, especially concerning a Sunday morning? We also should admit here that the current form of a church service that we think of as a church service is actually kind of new. Some records kind of imply the 1930s, where the twofold church service kind of came around. But church services, church gatherings have always been different throughout every single part of history. So anybody who's like, well, this is how you have to do a church service, nope, it's not. But whatever you're doing on a Sunday morning should also make sense within the context that you're in. So there are aspects that we do on a Sunday morning that somebody might say, like, this is old school. Yeah, because that reflects the context that we're in. There's other things that we do that are very different, unique to us, because it's us responding to the context that we're in. But I just want to make sure that I say this. I'm not saying this is advice or you have to listen to it, but if our church content, the formation we're producing, is event oriented, I think we are playing to a consumer identity that shouldn't be a part of the church's culture. And then if we're worried about quality, we have this issue of competition. And all this comes to, I say all of that to go, the way that we do event-oriented church services, those are all downloadable. So it's promoting consumerism. It's its own thing. We don't need to get into that, but it's all downloadable. And now you're competing with everybody. So I'm actually going to skip ahead a little bit. Formation in church services, spread the good news, become the body. That's what I mean by formation. Let's just get into this. This is what I mean by non-downloadable content. And I'll mention preaching briefly, but non-downloadable content. So the biggest thing I can make a case for the farmhouse is that the primary benefits of what we do together, those things aren't downloadable. So what are those? First is community. You can't download belonging, and you can't download connection, actual connection in proximity with other human beings. You can't download that. And one of the values of rural churches, people will say, like, it feels like family. I'm guessing that you've heard that said in some way or another. Well, okay, what's behind that? We're actually connecting with human beings. And this is where I go, our content sometimes isn't very good, but our connection is. And I think that's important. So what else can't you download? You can't download context. So I can get on YouTube or Spotify or Apple and hear any music I want, or listen to any speaker I want. And they're all very, very talented. But none of them will be speaking to my context. So I might not be the best public speaker, but I can get up any given Sunday and have my connected body there, and we can talk about something that is reflective of what's going on right here. That's not downloadable, okay? This is the big communication theory one that I don't have enough time to get into. I'll just reference, I've written about this in depth if you're like really interested in the theory behind it. But experience is not downloadable. And there's people who would push at me on this one, but one of the cases is that rhetoric doesn't change people, experience does. That's kind of like a communication maxim, right? And people wonder, like, man, we've been preaching this for 10, 20 years and it doesn't seem to be working. Yes, because rhetoric doesn't change people, experience does. Rhetoric is really valuable. You should still do it, but this is the same reason why, every carton of cigarettes has a warning label on it, and I've yet to meet somebody who stopped smoking because of that warning label. The experience is the thing we have to push. So how can your spaces that you create be experience oriented and not just rhetoric oriented? Okay, so then what about preaching? Trying to decide how much to get into this. Where are we at? Oh, like three minutes maybe. I'm over, aren't I?
No, you're still good. You're still good. Keep rolling,
Okay.
Tyler.
Okay. We're not. I think I'll just. Most of us know this. Preaching is spreading the good news and enacting the kingdom of God. It's not just a sermon that you give. So I guess I'm just giving permission that preaching can be different than the sermon style that really became popular only a few hundred years ago. And then back to communication, I'll just mention this because I think that seminaries and church leadership needs to start teaching people how to do it. And it's called extemporaneous dialectical communication. It has taken me a long time, but this is when I do preach, this is how I do it. And dialectical just means there's a dialogue, it's in conversation. And extemporaneous, you could also kind of think of that like improv, where there's some structure, but it's adaptable to what's going on. Currently, my co-pastor kind of was brought in with the traditional form of preaching, and we've been trying to go like, hey, how can you develop this extemporaneous dialectical process. And one of the things that you'll notice if you start doing this is preparing for sermons is actually really easy. You don't have to take all of this time to write. So what you end up doing is like you're constantly learning, researching, studying, listening, and then in a given moment that can express itself in any kind of form. Comedians are really good at this. Improv actors and actresses are really good at this. But that's all I'll say about preaching, because I want to get into this very quickly. This is a phrase that we use. If you're familiar with the agrarian tradition, this actually comes from the agrarian tradition. It's called place economy. And the where this actually comes from is this idea of, and again, there's some Wesleyanism here, of order the life of your community. And so asking these questions: what does your place need? What does your place have? What are you as a church capable of? And how are you going to execute this? How are you going to pull this off? And so when we're thinking about mission or ministries, when we're thinking about how we transform the places we are, this is all place economy language for us. So I want to get into, I think I got 4 things here that I want us to pay attention to for rural churches. And I saw in the chat these slides. I can send them to whoever at the conference and make them available. These are really important considerations for rural churches: our demographic, our resources. And this is when you're making these decisions, like, hey, what do we do? We need to pay attention. And I want to point out availability down at the bottom, because one situation in rural communities is we don't have the civil organizations and nonprofits that exist in a lot of urban spaces, right? So if there is an issue or there's a situation, how can the church step up to do that? And what I don't mean by this is, I'm going to jump to, what I don't mean by this is that you need to start something, because sometimes you just need to support infrastructure by somebody else. The church is what could be one of the best supporting mechanisms within a community. But sometimes it is starting or offering something. And one of the things that I tend to push for is like, how are you using your building and your property? So we have 12 acres of land here where we are. We should be using that. What about our building? Is our building one of the things, and I'm going to be really honest, this is still kind of a battle that I have to fight with perception, is, hey, this building isn't ours, it's our community's. We use it for a lot of things, but this needs to be everybody's space, because we just don't have anything like that in Metamora and in the school district that we're in. Okay, so you're trying to decide what are some things we should do. I want to kind of give you the lens that we use at the farmhouse for thinking about these things. And there's these different levels of focus, right? So you have, how do you make God's world real where you are? How do you bring the kingdom of God? How do you bring health? Okay, well, there's an individual level, and that's spiritual, mental, emotional, physical even. There's a relational level, and you have a communal level, and you have a cultural level, and then you have an ecological level. And if you want to create a healthy world, that's going to require healthy ecology with a healthy culture, with a healthy community, with healthy relationships, with healthy individuals. And we just need to pay attention that we're utilizing all of these. And so I'll just throw this up to end, Dan. This is just our sort of definition of place economy that we use. So I don't know if that's helpful to anybody, but I figured if I was going to use the phrase, I should probably tell you what we mean by it. So I'll just leave that up for a second if you want to use it. And again, I can send these slides out to the public domain, however it makes sense. But let's stop there, because I am much more interested in that dialectical thing that I said was important and haven't done for the past hour.
No, this is super great stuff, Tyler, and we've had a few good questions come in,
Okay.
and I want to begin our Q&A by really kind of pointing back to the beginning of your discussion where we talk about this idea of rural decline, because I think so often when individuals, especially those who have not lived in a rural community, enter into a rural community, and even those who are living as a part of a rural community, they think of rural decline, and usually that decline is understood in terms of economics, right? Well, we used to have this specific industry here, or
Mhm.
this sort of farming operation, and those employers are no longer here. If you could take a moment and if you could speak on the question of how do we define rural decline outside of just pure economic decline? Because I think so much of ministry or building the kingdom in rural places with rural people seeks to not only address that economic decline, but I think something far more important that is oftentimes ignored. So, if you could just speak on how do we define rural decline?
Yeah, and almost like a sub layer on the economic is subsistence. Um, at what point where rural communities no longer to sustain themselves? And I mean, listen, I'm sitting here with a very expensive microphone on a MacBook computer surrounded by stuff. I've obviously benefited from having items that are not from here. Um, but the decline being, can a community sustain itself indefinitely? If it cannot, then I would call that a decline. And now we're not talking about sustainability, we're talking about restorative, because how do you sustain a decline, right? Like, nope, we have to alter things, which is where I say church work comes up. But almost what uh Ian Ian Klein, maybe via Lindsay Stearns, I'm not sure if I'm reading that correctly, brought up of this self-esteem aspect of rural communities. And so beyond the economic, um, relational decline, connection decline, and I would say ecological decline is important. Um,
Yeah.
so the self-esteem, I think, plays into that, of when rural churches buy into the myth that they are backwards, or that they are less important, or that they are just places to go out and people have recreation and retreat to the peaceful countryside. Um, I think the decline in how we see ourselves and how we see our importance is an issue. And that's part of why I like going through, like, hey, remember all of this stuff. Um, and I know, like, when I first came out here, I literally was asked, somebody was like, why would you live out there?
Oh
You know,
yeah.
you want to build the kingdom of God, God's heart is for the city. And I was like, wait a second. I don't, can you show me that in the text somewhere? Because I don't see that. So I've had to spend a lot of time personally myself, but also within our church, of going like, hey, do we see our value here? Do we look at Metamora, and so we're in the Evergreen School District. Do we see the Evergreen School District as a people, or as a place that is a beacon for our culture, in our society, and our economy? Or are we the backwoods, nobody's from nowhere?
Mm.
Um, so decline is not just quantitative; it's very qualitative as well. Is maybe a way I'd sum that up.
Oh yeah, I think that's spot on, Tyler, and that's a question that I think a number of us get that are in rural context. I mean, I can't tell you how many times folks have asked me like, "Hey, why would you want to live in rural Muskingum County?" And of course, my response is, "Well, why wouldn't I?" Right? And so I think that begins to speak about like local church identity. So Lindsay, I think through Ian, asks this question. Um, what would you recommend to help the church gain self-esteem, confidence, and identity. And so, I hear you talking about, this comment that's been offered to you of like, well, God's heart is for the city. And I think for too long, the church has bought into that thinking because in many ways, models for, doing church in urban and suburban areas have been, placed on the rural church. I mean, like just
Mm-hmm.
real quickly, for example, when I started at my current church and I'm doing like the cleaning out of the old library, all I'm finding are like leadership texts that are out of like the mid 90s, like Willow Creek, Bill Hybels model. And I'm like, there is no world where that would ever work in this rural context. And so, so much of it, I think, is related to comparison, right? Comparing our rural church context to large suburban churches or urban churches and the model in which they're conducting their ministry. So we'll just kind of we'll lean into Lindsay's question here and ask, what would you recommend to help the church gain self-esteem, confidence, and identity?
Mm. And I think she even mentions this. Yeah. Comparison, and size and those kind of factors. Um, I think it's just worth pointing out that a lot of that low self-esteem or, negative self-image is probably based on those, uh, statistical comparisons where we're going, how many people, attend worship with you on Sunday?
Mm,
Well, 6, you know, or, 5% of the national average. And really those proportionally aren't accurate. Um, so I think looking at trying to start with that elephant of the room of, okay, let's look at the statistics here. Um, and how does that proportionally compare then to other places? What one thing I would say on our end was, um, changing how we see ourselves, as a church and what our role is as a
mm,
church. And I'll be really honest, like we still have these conversations a lot where I am, where we'll do something and go like, well, I think that flopped. That didn't go well at all. And so just for example, we had a farmhouse Sabbath, was one of the summer months, and there was barely anybody here. And there's a part of me still that goes like, well, that's a failure now. What do we do to fix it? And it was actually one of my other staff members. She said, that did you see how many people were connecting in the room? So maybe there was less people, but isn't that the point of why we do it in the first place? It happened more than when there has been 400 people here.
yeah.
And so reorienting, and that's why I think as a church, you should define, what is a church? What is our role as a church in a rural community? Because that becomes, I think, the lens through which you see these statistics then, and whether or not you are or are failing to live into that vision, or that question on, if your church closed. And sometimes the greatest thing for me is when somebody who is very vocal about, their atheism or their how much they despise the church in general. When somebody like that will contact me and say, thank you for what you did here, or thank you for this thing. Those are the kind of conversations where I'm like, okay, so that's more important than whatever numbers I end up filling out at the end of the year here. Um, and Dan, I think I would say part of the problem, and again, this is my opinion, part of the problem where that can cause this self-image is because we need certain statistics in order to fund the budget. And so I'm going to be really clear here. I am part-time and I have always been part-time, and I fully intend to always be part-time because of the strain that it puts on our church's budget. And that came to a head this past year. We had our 4th child, and we don't make a lot of money. I had to go I've always been bivocational, but with only one job. I had to go get a job and supplement our income And the church was going like, no, we'll find the money to pay you. And it's like, if you can find the money to pay me for that, then shouldn't we do something with it? And so being able to kind of free yourself from that financial component allows you to go like, oh no, this was the point, was the connection, or the point was the relationship, or the point was to help this group, or the point was to solve this. And we did that. So it doesn't matter if any of these statistics increase, we did the thing we were supposed to do. Having a smaller budget helps kind of liberate, at least that's been my experience, to do those things. But the biggest thing there is, as a church, are you very explicitly clear on what your purpose is and what your role is and what it should look like? And is that what you're doing to gauge whether or not you're successful? And just to counter that conversation a bit, and if you are failing to do that, you should be having really hard conversations about how you might be failing that identity. So it kind of goes both ways, but I would, starting from that place, and that's why I kind of take so much time to make sure that we look at those theoretical ideas, because otherwise you're guessing, right? You're not working with all the information.
Yeah, and I mean, so much of it, I think, in recovering a sense of identity within a local rural church, as Wendell Berry mentions, like a good local culture, in one of its most important functions is a collection of memories, ways, and skills that I think are necessary for a community to thrive, even in the face of depression or recession, boom and bust, feast and famine. And so, like, I mean, if you talk to any local farmer will tell you that if the local culture can't preserve and improve the local soil, then as both reason and history inform us, that local community will decay and perish. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think if like a community is to thrive or to even recover a sense of like self-esteem, then I think one of the ways we do that is we hold on to our local memory, right? And we keep that in place. And so, like, more and more country people, like city people, allow their economic and social standards to be set by, television and salesmen and outside
Mm-hmm.
experts. Local culture then has deep value, right? And so, how can we know one another if we've forgotten or have never learned one another's stories? And like, if we don't know one another's stories, how can we know whether or not to trust one another? And people who don't trust one another don't help one another, and they actually fear each other. And so that leads me to another question: is, it doesn't take a big budget to be neighborly, right? Or to live out what we see in Acts 2:42 and what the apostles dedicated themselves to. And so the question that I want to ask is, how does a church, or how does a community, uh, well, let me ask it this way: what role does a recovery of neighborliness, or Acts chapter 2, what role does neighborliness play in the rural church?
I would say that recovering it would be the first step. And that's only based on what I've seen in my context here. But we had, trying to decide how much depth to go in here.
Dive on in.
So we, in 2016, we had a young woman get kidnapped and murdered about a mile and a half from where I live. And remember, I'm not from here initially, but the initial reaction to that is shock, and there's a lot of trauma. And the primary question was, how could something like this happen here? And when you see tragedy, especially neighborly tragedy, happen in a rural community, that's one of the first questions. What it did for us, and just full disclosure, like, there was a lot of permission from the family, and a lot of interaction with the family. There was this conversation that was able to happen then, which was to go, you all grew up with this guy who did this. You know him. maybe we actually don't know each other. And this was also kind of venturing into where, and maybe it's like way old school to say this, but high-speed internet was becoming accessible to every single household at that time too. And so we started having these conversations on like, how has technology affected things here? So this ultimately leads to our emphasis of Farmhouse Sabbath, where we're going, can we just have a space where people can just come and be together, where we can actually get everyone that's willing to into the same space? Now, Farmhouse Sabbath is a formal event, and I don't think the answer here is always a formal event, but how do you get people together? Because one of the issues I felt by moving here as an outsider is we see people all the time. We're in proximity in a rural place, but there's not a lot of permission to know folks. And part of that is one, and again, my opinion, because of small town gossip, which is we already think we know everybody, and rarely do we actually know anybody. But two, as an outsider, I was not privy to those histories. And so I had to take a lot of time to start understanding histories. And that always began with like the joke of like, hey, everybody's related out here. That's weird. And literally that's how I was getting to understand the connections, is because there are all of these connections. So Farmhouse Sabbath was a way of creating this space where you can't guarantee that people are going to connect. You can't guarantee that people are going to come, but those who do they have a space to be in some kind of conversation? Because proximity, and all this goes back to the neighborly conversation. Look, I get to use my degree 2 times in one session. There are 4 dynamics of community that people generally agree on, and that's shared history, proximity, permanence, and shared vision. And proximity is one of those that is really conducive, whether or not you're in deep conversation or being really vulnerable. When you're around people, that changes the structure of the relationship. And then those other ones are important too: shared history, shared vision. And by the way, these are all essential components to the church, right? The church is already built to be conducive to that. But then another thing we did, so that's kind of like the quantitative, get people together. But then a qualitative thing we did is we started staking out space on Sunday mornings while we were already gathered to have people share their stories. And it's, when we first started it, everybody hated it. And they're like, why are you doing this? Then we went, I think it was during COVID, we went a season without having them at all. We call them object reflections. And people were like begging for them to be back. It's like, hey, isn't that funny how that works? It became normal. But that's that qualitative mark where you always see the same thing. Somebody who everybody knows talks and we use the extemporaneous dialectical process for this, talks about a component of their life where everybody in the room then goes, I never knew that. And then you realize that they're going, and I have this part of my story that's similar to yours. And so that was a really important way for us to create that qualitative connection. But beyond that, then, like, those are more formal things. We kind of set a precedent where neighborliness is actually one of our values as a church, and there's no formal sign-up sheet for that. It's a posture that we try to promote among our people of what does it mean for you to be a neighbor to folks out here. And Dan, I don't mean to bring this back to economics, but the agricultural system is one of the better ways to do that. And so what are the people, the places, the farmers, the businesses that are doing things in our community, which that all goes back to what you're talking about with local culture and getting people to take pride in, here's where we are and look how beautiful it is here. Like I hate when people go, they talk derogatorily about our community. Like, oh yeah, it's so boring here. I can't say what I was just going to say because of language issues, but my response to that is is very confrontational. We'll say that. And getting people that care about, like, this is important here. And at the end of the day, this is all you know. Your headspace can't venture out much further. I know you can drive in a car, you can get online, but you can actually connect with much more than what's right around you. And so at the end of the day, this should be all that you care about. And there's a chapter in the book called Learning to Die Somewhere, which is about that kind of idea. Not necessarily about the sort of pride of local culture, but committing to local culture, right? And so getting people to see, like, how do we depend on one another out here? And that's not just like social justice ministries or food bank or whatever. That's all sorts of different relational, individual, communal needs that we can share across the table. And I'll give you two examples that we're in the process of considering right now. So recently we had a longtime member of our church die, and when he was dying, this would have been like a week before he died, I'm sitting with him and he's lamenting to me that we don't have, nobody visits our cemeteries anymore, which there was a generation where that happened quite frequently. And so kind of at the catalyzing of his prompting, we're in process of trying to make a memorial trail. So a space for people to be, that also tells the story of our place. So we're kind of like, what does a reimagined version of a cemetery look like as a third space? So that's one idea we're working with. What was, where one of the needs that we're finding, I don't know how many of you have children or how many of you are around the sports world, but youth sports is like a really big thing. It's actually kind of crazy how and I'm saying this, I coach high school football, so I'm in the sports world. I see all of that. And youth sports culture still absolutely confuses me. And what we notice is that there's probably about half of our youth population doesn't have anything outside of sports. And when I was bringing up history and skills, right, of rural places, and this all comes on the coattails too of the Boy Scout situation is not going well, and we've actually seen that decline heavily in our area. So where can youth learn how to play musical instruments in a rural community? Because we can go into the suburbs and hire people for that, but can we have a culture of that here? What about knife skills? What about archery? What about improv theater? And so we've began this conversation of, can we start or help provide infrastructure for someone else to start a youth program that provides for people here? And that also coming in one of listening to our neighbors and hearing that, but then also going, and neighbors, we got to show up together in order to provide this, because there's no council, whatever, in our rural community that's going to do it themselves. And that's an opportunity for us, right? I don't know if I answered your question, Dan.
No, that's spot on, right? And taking opportunity in rural areas to invest in the youth of our community is so radically important, right? And I mean, I absolutely love similar to something we're doing out in Dresden, is that if we have an opportunity to create a culture in which real hard life skills are offered to the youth of our community, not only does that give them an outlet to learn those skills, but it also allows people within the church who may have been members of the church for decades to use skills that they may have never imagined they could actually use in a local church context, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think finding spaces where we can create those cultures around our youth are radically important. And let's just kind of, we'll stay on that topic of youth. And Mike asks a question in the chat where he says, Mike, I'm just going to read your entire response here. He
Mm-hmm.
says, I have found that people generally love their church. That's why they're there. The pressure they feel isn't so much about needing to be bigger for bigger's sake. The pressure comes from growing older. The kids who grew up there have moved away. And looking down the road 10, 20, or 30 years from now, the question is, who is going to be here to carry on? We love this place, but we have a finite lifespan. Who is going to make sure that the church continues to exist after we are gone? And so, Tyler, the big question for us today is, how would you address those pressures?
I probably want to emphasize too that this isn't just a church question.
Yeah.
It's a community question too. That when we're talking about rural decline, population literally is something that you're seeing happen. Man, so this is a hard question for me, and I need to play my hand as a very de-churched person. Youth ministry is not my strong suit, and by that I don't mean I'm not good at it. I don't like how it's often done, and this is a huge issue at the farmhouse right now. The other side of that is I have 4 children, and so I think about this almost constantly, and yeah, let's just talk about the community ingredients, right? Shared history. And okay, so another story. We have a woman who's been a part of this church who has become like a grandmother to me, and she is one of the most amazing people I have met, partly because of her age and her history, but also because of her perspective. And I was talking to her once about what she thought about some of the changes that were happening in the church. And she straight up said, I don't like them. But, and she included that and said, I know that this is good for the church's future. And I don't know how to bring it up in the least controversial way, but if we want the church to endure past our finite lives, then we have to approach the church in a way that transcends us as well. And what that woman taught me was that even under the stereotypes of old people, and they just want their, and she was going like, yeah, no, this is it's really cool to see all these folks here. I don't like it at all. Like the thing you guys just did, that was ridiculous, but it's more important to me that it's meaningful to other people than it is to me. And I was like, no, there's something in that. And there's this quote from Rabbi Tarfon, which I wish I had it on a slide because I don't have it memorized. But the essence of it is, realize that you are engaged in a work that's going to go on past you, and that has gone on in an unbroken covenant for thousands of years and is going to continue once you're gone. And yeah, I think that individual perspective is important. But then back to what you're saying about local culture, Dan, is if we're creating shared history, are we telling the story that we are part of? And not necessarily elevating it, because you have to also know where the story went wrong and what things weren't good. But do we invite people into our history and our tradition, and then allow it to continue to adapt? One of the frameworks that I use sometimes is the difference between museum docents and gardeners. Okay, so museum docents take the thing and they make it static, enshrine it behind glass, protect it, all of that. Gardeners have to take what they've inherited on the land and continue to guide it to grow, and then hand it off to somebody after them. And so I think there's a balance there of, we have to know where we come from, and then we have to allow the thing to go on past us. And so I think that perspective's important. I don't know if you guys can tell, but I have a lot of gray hair now. So I feel like I'm getting older and wise, as opposed to what I used to be.
Well, you're doing good, Tyler. Yours is turning gray. I'm losing mine. So
no, I say that in jesting, but very seriously, and I think it had more to do with having children, but I recognized at a point in my life where um, I stopped caring about what I was going to experience. And I started thinking through the lens of, all right, so what do I have to do for the thousands of people who will come after me? And that became just a question that we started asking as a church. When we went through the new church start process, we were going, hey, what do we need to do now so that in 50 years, and some of the people sitting there are going like, I won't be here in 50 years. It's like, yeah, that's part of it. Because so the farmhouse is 185 years old total. It used to be Metamora United Methodist Church, and so we try to have this. Hey, we're 185 years old. There were people who built this thing and got it to this point, and they're not here anymore. And so this is not just about us; it's also about them. And can we also expand that then to include everyone who come after us? And I've had to have this moment of like, I'm going to die, and do I really want the thing that I poured my life into to end when I die? I don't want that to happen. And so that's some of the language that we've used of going, this can't just be what we prefer. And that also is in the present of for our community, but also for those who come after us. And I think there's something about having a proper sense of proportion to history, because a lot of people they think of tradition, and by tradition, they mean what I've experienced over my time, and seeing like, okay, within history, what's had to happen for things to endure. And I'm not trying to make a denominational rift, but for all the criticism that the Catholic Church can have, they've nailed that one. And so what are some of the things that you see within the Catholic Church that endures over time? Well, the way that they handle staff, it's a little bit different than the sort of charismatic rock star pastor mentality we often take. The way that they understand tradition, that's a way that endures. So so if I was to sum this up, our perspective is really important of ourselves. So I think of that woman I told you about. But then also, are we teaching our history and understanding it, and then asking how it needs to continue?
Yeah, that's great, Tyler. So, as I'm hearing you talk, I think about the fact that in our history, in our rural communities, there was once a day that when the day's work was over, we didn't huddle inside around a screen, but we gathered on the front porches of our neighbors and told stories of those who came before us, stories of God's faithfulness, stories that made us laugh and cry, stories that made us vulnerable and really offered a window into who we are as people. And so, kind of considering the fact that the kingdom of God cannot be built from within our church offices, but it has to be built by living in community, right? So if you're not living in as a part of your community, like truly getting to know your community, there's no way you're going to be able to really truly build the kingdom of God where you're at and with the people who are yours in that space. And so I have a question that's kind of twofold. The first is, what role does narrative, what role do the stories we tell play in the recovery of rural culture and then expanding the kingdom in those rural places? And then the second thing, and I think this is a particularly relevant question, especially considering like the United Methodist appointment system, where many people are ministering in contexts where they're not from, and so they're immediately given this type of outsider status. And so, how is contextual intelligence then practiced in our rural communities when so many might be outsiders coming in? And then how do we then, in a practical manner, break down those boundaries?
Wow.
So that's a big question there, Tyler.
Yeah, you didn't tell me this was my dissertation. I think the best way to answer that is to ask people who have lived in the same place for a long time. But particularly from the outsider one, I've had to do this. Uh, there's a couple things that come to mind. One is I spent a lot of time listening, and I going to any place that I could and learning as much as I could. Um, Another thing that I did was I got involved uh, outside of the church. So the way that I did that was I volunteered to coach football at the local high school for a few years, and that gained credibility with people. And it also brought me in contact with a whole host of the population that I would have never known. There's something else that, maybe this isn't as important to others, but so when I was first here, everybody would introduce me as the new pastor, right? The new pastor of the church. And I was like, I wonder what that person's thinking of me right now. And you get painted with a very specific brush. And so I went out of my way. I like to think of myself as a cultural chameleon, and being able to adapt to whatever cultural ethos I'm in. And I worked really hard to be able to connect with people on a variety of levels, to kind of go, hey, no, I'm like you in that. And so there was like the farming and homesteading community. Well, I had to show like, no, I do that as well. That's important to me, which doesn't always come across when they go, oh, you're a pastor. They don't necessarily think of that. The sports community was another one. But then especially the de-church population is showing that, no, I can run in that wheelhouse. What I'll say to that too is, at first, that pissed off the very traditional church people, so they didn't necessarily like that. And because I was still a pastor, it kind of bothered the non-church people. So I was kind of left without anybody owning, bringing me into their self. But the more that I was around and just was present, so again, proximity, the more that I shared in that vision of the community itself, and the more that I displayed a sense of permanence. And that's what the chapter in the book, Learning to Die Somewhere, is all about. I started using language of like, no, I intend to die in this land. I am here for the long haul. I am not here because of anything this community offers me, because let's all be honest, it doesn't have much to offer. I'm here because I want to be here. And as that went on, I was kind of brought into the fold. And more practically, the way that you really do that is do everybody's funerals, officiate everybody's funerals, because that is one of the most intimate spaces that somebody can let you in on, and how you handle that can change everything. And like, I don't know if our training for pastors with funerals is just that terrible, but I would do a funeral and I would just do it in a way that made sense to me. And people would go, that was the best funeral. It's like, what are you guys used to? I just talked about this person. And, but that being in those intimate spaces, every time something tragic happened, I would show up and just, hey, I'm here. But I'll also say to that, as I was brought into the fold, I was brought into the fold, which meant a lot of nasty conversation about my life too. And I'm now at the point, so I've been here for 10 years, and there are a group of people, they just don't like me. And whether or not it's true that they actually know me, they've made that decision, right? And so now the work is different of how can I continue to surprise people who think they understand me. And so I'm still learning how to belong here, but it's never a romantic process, I guess. Um, I don't actually remember your question. I remember it was really loaded.
Yeah, oh yeah, I love those loaded questions. So as a part of talking about, kind of knowing your context and practicing that contextual intelligence, and
Mhm.
as you are, kind of intentionally doing your best to be brought into the fold, because being brought into the fold of a local rural context, it does take effort, right? And it takes a certain sense of intentionality, in that you are there to love that place and to invest in that place, right? I use a phrase all the time in our little village, like, hey, we're all about investing in the village, and that this is our home and these are our people.
Mhm.
As a part of that, what role does like narrative storytelling play in the recovery of rural culture and then expanding the kingdom of God? And like for me, I think of like that's when we gather and when we connect with one another, so much of our content is not that type of, downloadable content that you speak of, but it's rather like just the stories that we tell gathered, and usually it happens around food. There's a lot of food involved in my rural church context, but that food is always accompanied with a lot of storytelling. And so, if you could speak on what role does storytelling play in the recovery of rural culture and expanding the kingdom in our rural communities?
Uh, I I think part of the implication there is like understanding the story and history of where you are.
Right.
Um, that's I would say giving people a microphone is a good way to do that on one hand. Letting people tell their stories frequently. Um, at the same time, the working with the present narratives, um, this is where like contextual preaching actually can be really helpful, because every time you get a group of people together, you have an opportunity to talk about the reality of your context.
Yes.
And I just don't know that that gets considered a lot. Like when forming a sermon, maybe we'll have sermon illustrations or things like that that deal with it. But actually forming content around something that's a real part of your place. We just for the Sunday before All Saints Day, we just had a Sunday where we just talked about the saints of our community and the people who had gone before us and what it means for us to be a part of that. And that's all we did. Uh, there wasn't really a sermon that you would think of, but I don't know that anybody necessarily noticed. It was just a chance for us to talk about these stories. Um, I'm trying to think of more other formal ways we do it. Um, I don't know if this is exactly connected to the narrative storytelling, but one thing we do, we call them barn stations, which is kind of one of our creative forms of a church service. But uh, one of them is about death, and the result of it is that when we're inviting somebody through the mourning process, the grieving process, and a result is that you put pictures up of the people that you're reflecting on, and then we keep all of these every year, and then we put them up after that, and we take them down All Saints Day. So for about half of the year, if you walk into our barn, you just see all of these faces of our past. And I think that's one way to do that. Um, I think teaching the history of a place is important too, but I also kind of would want to push there, Dan, like history of Metamora doesn't begin in 1815. It's actually really long neglected history out here, and we don't tend to remember that. Um, and speaking about native and indigenous populations is not a bad idea for rural communities. Um, so that's another part of that. Uh, but then also I think there's something narrative about talking about the narrative of future. And this is almost going back to the low self-esteem, low self-image, negative self-image conversation of, are we offering not only a shared history, but also a shared vision? That's not just like theological kingdom of God, but is theological kingdom of God about this specific place? Are we offering that vision to people when we preach, when we do ministries? And I think that's just as important. And again, I'm kind of coming from a bias of my children. And this is something that I try to do really intentionally with my children, is understanding, hey, this is where you are, but also, and what are you going to do with it? So I think that kind of storytelling plays a role. But seriously, what happens if every time you give a sermon, no matter what kind of sermons you do, if the implication is, and what does this look like for the future of this community? How does that happen here? Or when you're casting vision at Charge Conference, is it just about like the statistics or, the ministry ideas or the changes, or is it about, here's what our community needs? I think the narrative storytelling part, your budget should reflect this narrative that you're a part of. And narrative budgets are a thing that we've used in the past, and that can be really helpful.
Yeah, I think, recognizing that narrative, I think in many ways situates us recognizing where we came from, but it also orients us towards like the hope of the future, right? That there is hope in community, people connected and gathered together.
Mm.
And there's actually hope in our community, like the community that we're in. And we've talked about Wendell Berry a few times today, and Wendell Berry, in I think it's one of his 1988 essays, talks about the fact that he believes that, and this is a controversial statement, he believes that one revived rural community would be more convincing and more encouraging than all government and university programs in the last 50 years. And he goes on to say, like, to be authentic, a true encouragement and a true beginning, it would have to be a revival accomplished by the ancient rule of neighborliness, by the love of precious things, and by a wish to be home, right? And like I think
Yeah,
that's why we tell those stories, because it grounds us in our past and in our present, in
yeah.
the good, the bad, and the ugly, but it also points us toward the hope of the future, like gathered together in community and in
Mhm.
present.
Well,
So
and
yeah, go ahead.
I want to add to that there's a component of it of recognizing that you're not going to see the end of it either,
Yeah, yeah.
right? And that's part of that. My hair's getting gray. I'm realizing these things of, oh, I'm going to die before this ends, or before this is finished. I'm not going to see the end of this thing.
Right, you're
Um,
planting that tree and you'll never see it grow to
mhm,
maturity. Yeah.
yeah. But then also, like, think of a text like Isaiah 61. This is spoken to a people who's out of exile, but none of the things it's saying has happened. Why does a text like Isaiah 61 exist? It's offering a vision about the future with the sole intention of catalyzing action in the present. And we're getting close to Advent, right? Well, this is the whole experience of Advent, of us going, that vision is not yet. So what do we do now? How do we let the vision pull us to the future? And I think we should be doing that with our communities, and this is where I go. I'm sort of teaching my children things, knowing like, hey, you have to pick this up because I'm going to, one day, and it's going to be up to you. So, yeah, I do think that at the end of the day, a real community that believes in itself and that actually has those four ingredients of community being practiced, like, that's the biggest thing the rural church can do. Unfortunately, I don't see that getting pushed. And that's part of the reason that Michael Beck and I wrote this book, was to go, can we at least try to add one different perspective into the church conversation and the rural conversation? So that's, you're very rarely have I had somebody quote Wendell Berry to me. And I can't tell you how happy that makes me.
Live and breathe that stuff. Well, I tell you, this is just great stuff, Tyler. We really appreciate you being here with us today. I want to thank everybody who joined this conversation. I really appreciate some of the questions that came through. We would love to hear your feedback. Terry's actually going to put a link to the feedback survey in the chat if you would be so willing and so helpful to fill that out for us. This training today has been recorded and will be available to you to go back. You can take a look at Tyler's slides. I know I've got like 4 pages of notes here that I was taking. You'll also be getting a follow-up email with a survey and the link to rewatch this training, and a continued education certificate is available as well. And so let Terry know via email. And stay tuned for more minis coming in 2023 that will be largely based on your feedback. And so, again, just thank you so much to Tyler for joining us and allowing us to learn from him today. Really enjoyed seeing all of you here today, and can't wait to see all of you in the future and continue this discussion. All right, so with that, Tyler, I think you're going to stay on for just a moment. We can chat, but everybody else, you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. No, I'm just kidding. Thank you all so much, and have a great day.
Hey, Julie. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, Julie, did you have another question?
No, I was just filling out the survey.
Oh,
Yeah.
great.
Thanks for the mini. Have a good day.
You too.